I said calmly during the divorce. "I'll keep that land instead of the $70 million. My wife mocked me. "Keep it, it's useless anyway." For months later, she drove by with new boyfriend just to take a look. What she saw left her frozen. "Keep that, it's useless anyway." Veronica almost spat those words as she signed the divorce papers, pointing contemptuously at the 8-hectare barren land I'd just chosen instead of $70 million. Enrique, her lawyer, looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Fernando, her new boyfriend, smiled from the office doorway, leaning against the frame with the arrogance of someone who knows he's just won. She took the money, the investments, the house in the city, everything. I was left with that dusty piece of land on the outskirts, that place she always hated, that pile of stones that didn't even have a paved road. I signed without argument. She walked out laughing, clinging to Fernando's arm, looking at me one last time like someone looking at a stray dog on the road. For months later, she passed by that land with her boyfriend just to mock me once more, to show him the ridiculous place her pathetic ex-husband had chosen over a fortune. What she saw when she arrived left her completely paralyzed. But to understand that moment, to understand why my hands didn't tremble when I signed those papers, you need to know how all this began. 25 years earlier, I was a 25-year-old civil engineer with a freshly printed degree and calloused hands from working in construction since I was 16. My father was a bricklayer his whole life, then a foreman, finally a small builder. He built homes for humble families, charged fairly, and slept soundly. When he died of a heart attack at 62, he left me two things: his impeccable reputation in the trade and that 8-hectare plot of land in what was then practically the urban desert. An irregular lot full of stones and weeds, so far from downtown that not even buses reached it. Mom told me Dad always believed that land would be worth something someday, that the city would grow that way. I put the deed in a drawer and moved on. I met Veronica at an urban development conference. She was studying business administration at a private university, the kind where the parking lots were full of imported cars. I was giving a talk on sustainable construction materials, a topic no one cared much about back then. She approached me afterward in a pearl-colored dress that seemed too elegant for a university auditorium and told me my ideas were interesting but impractical, that in the real world, people wanted quick results, not slow processes. I liked her directness. I liked that she didn't treat me as if I were special just because I'd given a talk. 3 months later, we were dating. 6 months later, she met my mother. A year later, we married in a small ceremony she barely tolerated, always making it clear she would have preferred something bigger, more visible, more impressive. The first few years were good, or at least I thought they were. I worked at a medium-sized engineering firm designing structures for commercial buildings. I earned well, enough to rent a decent apartment so she could finish her master's and go out for dinner on Fridays. Veronica got a job at a consulting firm, a place where everyone wore expensive suits and spoke in terms that sounded important but meant little. She fit in perfectly there. I remained the same, wearing my work boots when visiting construction sites, preferring to review blueprints instead of attending business dinners. She started making small comments at first. "Daniel, you should buy more formal clothes. Daniel, don't talk so much about concrete and steel at social gatherings. Daniel, important people don't work with dirty hands." I nodded, changed the subject, kept being who I was. We bought our first house when we'd been married 5 years. It wasn't the house she wanted. Veronica had marked huge residences in magazines with enormous gardens, 3-car garages, living rooms that looked like hotel lobbies. I showed her the numbers, explaining we could buy something more modest now and move later when my income grew. She agreed, but with that expression, I learned to recognize the expression of someone who's yielding, but keeping track of every concession. The house was in a quiet middle-class neighborhood, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, functional kitchen. To me, it was perfect. To her, it was evidence of my lack of ambition. Years passed, and the cracks became more visible. Veronica climbed the ladder at her company, earning more than me, attending events where she met people she considered successful, entrepreneurs, investors, people who moved big money and spoke of opportunities. I remained at my firm designing solid structures, solving engineering problems, coming home with dust on my shoes. She started coming home late, mentioning names I didn't know, comparing. Fernando is a partner in an import company. He's 38 and already has 2 houses. Ramiro opened his own consulting firm and bills millions a year. Enrique, the lawyer, bought a yacht last month. I listened while preparing dinner, while reviewing blueprints at the dining room table, while living my life unaware that for her, that life was a sentence. My father's land remained forgotten. Veronica only mentioned it to mock. 8 hectares of nothing in the middle of nowhere, she'd say. You should sell it, give it away, do something useful with it. I always said, maybe someday, that there was no hurry, that the place had sentimental value. She'd snort and change the subject, as if talking about feelings was a waste of time. I never told her that every 3 months I drove there. I walked that irregular land. I watched as the city slowly grew in that direction. I never mentioned the urban planning meetings I attended, the development maps I studied, the contacts I maintained at the municipality. To her, I was predictable, boring, stagnant, and maybe it was better that she thought that. Veronica met Fernando at one of those corporate dinners I rarely accompanied her to. She came home that night talking about him with a sparkle in her eyes I hadn't seen in years. Fernando this, Fernando that. He imports technology from Asia, has offices in 3 countries. He manages an investment portfolio I could never imagine. I was on the sofa reviewing blueprints for a shopping center we were designing and just nodded without looking up. I should have noticed it then, that exaggerated excitement talking about another man, but I was focused on solving a structural load problem, or maybe I just didn't want to see it. It's easier to ignore what you don't want to face. The following months were a silent choreography of distancing. She came home later and later, always with perfectly reasonable excuses. Meeting with international clients, extended business dinner, networking event she couldn't miss. I dined alone, heating what I prepared hours earlier, watching the food get cold on her plate that was never used. I didn't complain, I didn't ask too many questions. I'd learned years ago that, with Veronica, insisting only led to arguments where she turned my concern into my flaw. If I asked her why she was late, the answer was always the same. Because someone in this house has to be ambitious, Daniel. Someone has to think about the future, about growing, about not settling for a mediocre life. Mediocre. That word became her favorite. My work was mediocre. Our vacations were mediocre. Our conversations were mediocre. I was mediocre. She said it without shouting, without raising her voice, just stating an undeniable fact. When we celebrated our 20th wedding anniversary, she wasn't even home. She called at 11 p.m. to say she'd stayed overnight at Sonia's, her friends, because they'd drunk too much at a bar celebrating someone's promotion. I blew out the candles on the cake I'd bought, put away the gift I'd chosen for her, and went to sleep on a side of the bed that felt bigger and bigger. But while all this was happening, something else was going on. 8 months before she filed for divorce, I got a call from Ramiro. He and I had studied together, though our paths diverged after college. Ramiro specialized in urban planning and worked for the city's development secretariat. He met me at a downtown cafe, one of those old places with 4 mica tables and watery coffee. When I arrived, he had a manila folder on the table and a serious expression. Daniel, he said, I need to show you something before it becomes public. He opened the folder and spread out a map. It was the new Metropolitan Transport Master Plan, a massive infrastructure project the government was about to approve. My heart began to beat faster when I saw the red line crossing the map. The new public transport corridor, with 3 interconnection stations, passed exactly through the area where my land was. Exactly. Ramiro explained that the project was in its final approval phase, that the technical studies were already complete, that the bidding for the works would begin in less than a year. Those 8 hectares of yours are going to be right in the zone of greatest commercial development for the next 5 years, he told me. When this is public, that land will increase in value by 1,000%, maybe more. He asked if I was interested in selling before the official announcement, because he knew investors who'd pay well even now. I told him no. I told him I needed to think, but in reality, I was thinking, I was already calculating, I was already seeing beyond what Ramiro imagined. That night, I arrived home, and Veronica wasn't even there. I took my father's land deed from the drawer where I'd kept it for years. I read it completely, every clause, every legal detail. The land was in my name, solely mine, because it was a direct inheritance prior to the marriage. In case of divorce, I could claim it as separate property. I sat at the dining room table with that deed in my hands and felt something I hadn't felt in years: absolute clarity. It wasn't revenge I was planning. It wasn't even justice. It was simply seeing the real value of things while others only saw the surface. The following months were strange. Veronica became even more distant, but I became calmer. I started going to the land every week, always early on Saturdays, when she slept in late after her Friday nights that increasingly ended in the early morning. I discreetly hired a surveyor to update the measurements. I paid out of my own pocket for soil mechanics study. I spoke with Ramiro about the legal requirements for commercial developments in that area. Each step was small, invisible, calculated. At home, I remained the same old Daniel, calm, predictable, unambitious, according to my wife's words. One night, Veronica arrived after 2 a.m. I was awake in the living room, not because I was waiting for her, but because I was reviewing financial projections on my laptop. She took off her shoes at the entrance, champagne-colored high heels that cost more than my weekly salary, and looked at me with a mix of tiredness and contempt. "We need to talk," she said. I'd expected it. I'd been waiting for weeks. We sat at opposite ends of the sofa, that sofa where we once watched movies together on Sundays. And she uttered the words with clinical coldness. "I want a divorce, Daniel. This isn't working. It never really worked. You're a good person, but I need more from life. I need someone who understands me, who has ambitions, who wants to grow." I'm sorry. She wasn't sorry. That was obvious. But I didn't feel pain either. Not the way I would have expected. I only felt a kind of relief mixed with determination. I told her it was fine, that I understood, that we could do this civilly. She seemed surprised by my calm. She probably expected drama. Tears, please. Instead, I just asked when she wanted to start the legal process. She already had an answer. Enrique, her lawyer friend, could handle everything. Of course he could. They'd surely discussed this before she told me. Maybe they'd been planning it for weeks, months. It didn't matter. I had my own plan, and no one, except Ramiro, knew it existed. The following week, Veronica temporarily moved in with Antonia, her sister, while we prepared for the legal process. The house felt empty but breathable, like when you open the windows after a storm passes. I started moving my pieces more freely. I contacted an architect specializing in commercial developments. I looked for information on government subsidies for projects in newly developing areas. I spoke with 2 construction firms about possible partnerships. All this while officially I was just an engineer about to get divorced, about to lose everything according to what people whispered. Mutual friends, the few we had already taken sides. Poor Veronica, married to someone so unambitious. Poor Daniel, she deserved something better. I let them talk. People always need a simple narrative, and I had no intention of complicating it. The meeting in Enrique's office was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. Veronica arrived 15 minutes late, accompanied by Fernando. That told me all I needed to know about how long they'd really been together. He wasn't just a new boyfriend, he was the reason for the divorce, the reason my wife had decided that 25 years could be thrown away. Fernando had that air of a successful man that comes standard with money, an expensive watch, an impeccable suit, a practiced smile. He shook my hand with a firm grip that tried to prove something, and I shook his with the same neutral strength I used in any work meeting. Enrique invited us to sit in his office with high ceilings and framed diplomas. Those diplomas people hang to remind you they're more educated than you, more capable, more prepared to legally destroy you, if necessary. The division of assets was surprisingly quick. Veronica had done her homework. She had a detailed list of everything. The house valued at $800,000, joint investments totaling $43 million, savings in 3 different bank accounts reaching another $27 million. The car registered in both our names, the furniture, even the damn crystal glasses we received as a wedding gift and never used. Enrique slid the documents across the table like someone dealing cards at a casino, and each sheet was another thing I was losing. Veronica wanted the house. She wanted the investments. She wanted the savings. She wanted everything that represented economic security, status, financial future. I let her talk. I let her enumerate each item with that businesswoman's voice she'd perfected in her consulting years. When she finished, Enrique looked at me with that mix of professionalism and pity that lawyers use with clients they know are going to lose. And you, Mr. Daniel, what do you request from the division of assets? Fernando leaned back in his chair next to Veronica, crossing his arms, waiting to see me beg for something, anything. Veronica had that expression of anticipated boredom, as if she already knew I'd ask for something sentimental and useless. I opened my briefcase, took out my father's land deed, and placed it on the table. I just want this, I said. The 8-hectare plot on the outskirts. That's all. The silence lasted a full 3 seconds. Enrique looked at the document, frowned, checked something on his laptop. Veronica exchanged a glance with Fernando, and then she laughed. It wasn't a nervous or uncomfortable laugh. It was a genuine burst of laughter from someone who just heard the best joke of the year. Are you kidding? She said, wiping an imaginary tear from her eye. That land is worthless, Daniel. It's a piece of dirt full of rock miles from anywhere relevant. It has no utilities, no paved access, not even a fence. Fernando smiled and put a hand on her shoulder, a possessive gesture she accepted naturally. Let him have it, honey, he said. If he wants to keep that abandoned lot instead of fighting for something of real value, that's his problem. Enrique reviewed the numbers on his computer. According to the updated cadastral appraisal, the land has a market value of approximately $200,000, he said. Mr. Daniel, are you aware that you're giving up assets worth $70 million in exchange for a property worth less than 1% of that amount? I told him yes. I told him I understood the numbers perfectly. I told him that land had sentimental value because it was my father's, and I preferred to keep something that meant something to me instead of fighting for money. Veronica stopped laughing and looked at me with something close to condescending tenderness. That look you give a child who insists on keeping a broken toy. You know what, Daniel? She said, keep that. It's useless anyway. It really is. But if that makes you happy, if carrying that piece of desert helps you sleep at night thinking about your dad, or whatever, go ahead. I'm not going to fight for something that's not worth it. Fernando nodded, as if approving his new partner's generosity. Enrique drafted the clause in real time, his fingers flying over the keyboard while I remained motionless in my chair. Mrs. Veronica accepts that the land located at kilometer 32 of the Southern Highway, with deed number 4583, will remain the sole and exclusive property of Mr. Daniel, without right to subsequent claim. Both parties agree that this asset doesn't form part of the conjugal patrimony to be divided. We signed. My hand didn't tremble when I put my name on that line. Veronica signed with a smile, that smile of absolute triumph. Fernando kissed her cheek. Enrique put the documents in a manila folder and shook both our hands, wishing us luck in our new lives. We left the building together, but separate. They went to the black Mercedes parked in the preferential spots. I went to my work truck with the rusty bumpers. I watched them drive away. I watched Veronica laugh at something Fernando told her. I watched her turn one last time to look at me, standing there in the parking lot. There was no pity in her eyes, only relief. Relief at being free of the dead weight I represented in her upwardly mobile life. I drove to my new home. It wasn't really a home. It was a rented apartment in a 4-story building without an elevator in a neighborhood Veronica would have called working class with thinly disguised disgust. A single bedroom, integrated kitchen, bathroom with cream-colored tiles that were once white. I climbed the stairs with a cardboard box containing my things, clothes, engineering books, a photograph of my parents on their wedding day. I hadn't taken anything else from the house. I didn't want anything else. I sat on the only furniture I had, a second-hand sofa I bought for $200, and took out my phone. I dialed Ramiro's number. He answered on the second ring. It's done, I said. The land is completely mine. There was a pause. Daniel, brother, I hope you know what you're doing, he said. I told him yes. I told him to trust me. We hung up, and I stared at the ceiling of that small apartment, listening to the noises of the neighbors through the thin walls. The next few days were an adjustment, waking up in a single bed after 25 years of marriage, cooking for one on a stove with only 2 burners, going to work and facing the stares of my colleagues, those stares that said I'm sorry without uttering the words. Everyone knew about the divorce. In a medium-sized engineering firm, gossip travels fast. Poor Daniel. His wife left him for someone with more money. Of course, she was always very ambitious. He's a good guy, but he never had that spark, you know? I let them talk. I focused on my work, reviewing structures, signing blueprints, attending meetings with contractors. On the outside, I was the same competent, quiet engineer as always. Inside, I was activating every contact I'd cultivated in 20 years of my career. I hired a lawyer specializing in real estate development, not a flashy one like Enrique, but one of those quiet professionals who work efficiently and without fuss. I explained my situation, showed him the land deed, told him about the upcoming transport corridor. He looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "If what you're telling me is true and that project is approved as you plan, you'll need a solid legal structure to maximize the value. Company formation, advanced building permits, contracts with developers before the official announcement. We can do this, but it will require initial investment." I asked him how much. $50,000 to start, he said. $70,000 if we want to move quickly. I had exactly $68,000 in a personal account Veronica didn't know about. It was money I'd saved from extra jobs over the years, small consulting gigs I did on weekends. Independent projects I never mentioned because she would have considered them insignificant, invisible money to someone who only saw big numbers. I transferred $50,000 to my lawyer that same afternoon. He started working immediately, forming a limited liability company, requesting preliminary land use permits, discreetly approaching 2 medium-sized construction firms interested in commercial development projects. All this while I continued living in my rented apartment, eating off plastic plates, wearing the same clothes until they needed washing. 2 weeks after the divorce, I established a routine no one would have considered interesting. I woke up at 5 a.m., made instant coffee in my tiny kitchen, checked emails related to the land. By 7, I was at my regular job designing structures for projects that paid my rent and food. At 6 p.m., I left the office and drove directly to the land, every day without fail. I arrived as the sun began to set, parked my truck on the uneven dirt road, and walked those 8 hectares with a notebook and a camera. I photographed every angle, mentally measured distances, marked strategic points with wooden stakes I bought at the hardware store. To anyone passing by, I was simply a 50-year-old man sentimentally attached to a useless piece of land. And that was exactly the image I needed to project. Ramiro called me on a Thursday night. "Daniel, the official announcement of the transport corridor will be public in 6 weeks," he said. "The bidding for the works opens 2 weeks later. When that happens, all the land in that area will turn to gold." He paused. "People are asking about properties in the area. Big investors. If you want to sell now, I can get you a good price, even before the announcement." "How much?" I asked. He did mental calculations. "Probably millions of dollars, maybe 2.5 if we negotiate well. It's 10 times what it's officially worth now." I told him no. I told him I had other plans. "Daniel, brother, I know you have your reasons, but millions of dollars isn't a small amount, especially for someone who just lost everything in a divorce." I thanked him for his concern and asked him to trust me just a little longer. That night, I met with the architect I'd hired. His name was Julio. He was 40 and had a portfolio full of successful shopping centers in medium-sized cities. We met at a cafe near the land, one of those roadside cafes where truckers stop to rest. Julio spread out the first sketches on the coffee-stained table. "A mixed-use commercial development," he said, pointing to the lines on the paper. "Ground floor commercial with rental spaces, 2 levels of offices, underground parking for 300 vehicles. We're taking advantage of the irregular topography of the land to create stepped levels. We reduce excavation costs. We maximize visibility from the future transport station. I studied the drawings with professional attention. Numbers danced in my head. Construction cost, rental projections, return on investment. How much to build this? I asked. Julio took out his calculator. Between $12 and $15 million, he said, depending on materials and construction speed. I didn't have $15 million. I didn't even have $1 million. What I had was land that would soon be worth much more than that, and the ability to see 3 moves ahead while others barely saw the board. I told Julio to continue with the design. I asked him to prepare a complete executive project, something that could be presented to investors or banks. He asked how I planned to finance this. I told him not to worry about that yet, that I just needed the project ready for when the time came. He nodded, put away his papers, and left me alone in that cafe with my cold cup of coffee. Outside, a trailer passed, kicking up dust on the road. That road that would soon become a paved avenue, with traffic lights, with public transport, with thousands of people passing daily in front of what was now just empty land. At work, my colleagues had stopped asking me how I was. People get tired quickly of others' tragedies, especially when there's no visible drama to feed. I was the quiet divorced man who kept doing his competent job, no complaints, no explanations, perfect invisible. During lunch breaks, instead of socializing, I reviewed building regulations in urban development zones. I studied successful cases of similar projects in other cities. I made discreet calls to contractors asking for prices, construction times, material availability. Each conversation was another piece of the puzzle I was silently assembling. One Friday afternoon, as I left the office, I saw Veronica. It was completely by chance. She was entering an expensive downtown restaurant, the kind of place where dishes are decorated with edible flowers and wine costs more than my monthly rent. She was on Fernando's arm, wearing a champagne-colored dress that shimmered under the entrance lights. She looked happy, radiant even. He held the door for her with one hand while answering his phone with the other. Important man multitasking. She saw me. Our eyes met for a second. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a kind of quiet satisfaction, like someone seeing confirmation that they made the right decision. I raised my hand in a neutral greeting. She nodded slightly and entered the restaurant. I felt nothing, no pain, no anger, no nostalgia. Only the cold certainty that everyone was exactly where they deserved to be. I drove to the land as I did every night. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky orange and violet. I parked in the same spot as always and walked to the center of the lot. From there, you could see the entire expanse. 8 hectares that to Veronica were garbage. To Fernando were a funny anecdote about the pathetic ex-husband. To Enrique were a negotiation mistake his client had generously allowed. To me, they were the future. I took out my phone and took a photograph of the sunset over that empty land. I saved it in a special folder I titled, Simply Before. Someday there would be a folder called After, but that was still a long way off. 3 weeks after the divorce, I received a call from Antonia, Veronica's sister. It was unexpected. She and I always had a cordial but distant relationship. "Daniel, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice tense. We met in a park near her house. She arrived in jeans and a sweatshirt, very different from the well-dressed woman I used to see at family gatherings. She sat on the bench next to me and for a minute said nothing, just watched the children playing on the swings. Finally, she spoke. "I know Veronica treated you badly. I know the divorce was unfair. I try to talk to her, to make her see reason, but you know my sister. Once she decides something, there's no way to change her mind." I told her she didn't have to apologize for her. Antonia shook her head. "It's not an apology, it's a warning. Fernando isn't who he says he is. He's in debt, Daniel. A lot of debt. His company is in trouble. She doesn't know because he's very good at hiding things, but I have a friend who's an accountant who worked with him and told me. That guy is looking for financial exits, and I'm afraid Veronica is one of them." I processed the information in silence. Antonia continued. I know you probably don't care after everything that happened, but she's still my sister, and I don't want to see her destroyed. I just thought you should know. Maybe you can do something." I thanked her for telling me. I told her I'd keep it in mind, but deep down, a part of me felt something close to poetic irony. Veronica had exchanged $70 million secure in a piece of land that would soon be worth a fortune for a man who turned out to be a financial fraud. It wasn't my problem. It wasn't my responsibility to warn her. She had made her choice based on appearances, on what Fernando projected versus what he really was. And now she would have to live with the consequences. That night in my apartment, I prepared a simple dinner, pasta with canned tomato sauce. I ate in front of my laptop, reviewing for the umpteenth time the financial projections for the commercial development. The numbers still worked. With the official announcement of the transport corridor, the value of the land would multiply. With that value as collateral, I could secure bank financing for the construction. With the construction finished, the rents from the commercial premises and offices would generate constant monthly income. It wasn't a quick plan, it wasn't an easy plan, but it was a solid plan, built on real knowledge, strategic patience, and perfect timing. Everything Veronica considered my flaws, my slowness, my lack of visible ambition, my obsession with technical details were exactly the tools that were building my future. The official announcement came exactly when Ramiro said it would. On a Tuesday at 10 a.m., the government published the Metropolitan Transport Master Plan in all media. 3 new rapid transit lines, 17 stations, an investment of $2 billion in infrastructure over the next 4 years. The maps were everywhere, in newspapers, on news channels, on social media. And there, marked with a red circle, was the Southern Corridor, passing exactly where my land had been quietly waiting for decades. My phone started ringing 20 minutes after the announcement. "Ramiro, first. You did it, brother. Now the good stuff comes." Then, my lawyer, "We need to move fast, Daniel. In 2 days, offers will start coming in." Then, Julio, the architect, "The project is ready. Tell me when a present." I didn't answer all the calls immediately. I took a moment in my office, closed the door, sat in my chair, and just breathed. That land had been waiting 25 years. I'd been preparing this silently for 8 months. And now, in a matter of hours, everyone would know what I already knew. That those 8 hectares of useless land, that piece of desert Veronica had given away with a laugh, were now worth at least $10 million and would continue to rise. I opened my laptop and started receiving emails, real estate firms asking if the land was for sale, developers offering partnerships, even a big bank suggesting a meeting to discuss financing options. I responded selectively, only to those with serious proposals, real numbers, proven capability. That afternoon, I met with my lawyer and Julio in my apartment. I didn't have a fancy office to receive visitors, so we used my dining table with its scratched surface. Julio spread out the complete executive project. Digital renders showed a modern commercial complex with glass and steel facades, integrated green spaces, sustainable design. 32 commercial units on the ground floor, 40 offices on 2 upper levels, parking for 300 vehicles. My lawyer put the numbers on the table. With the current value of the land, we can get a bank loan for $12 million for construction. Alternatively, we can look for investor partners who will contribute capital in exchange for a percentage of the profits, or a combination of both. Which do you prefer? I thought for a full 5 minutes while they waited. Finally, I spoke. Bank loan for 60% of the construction. We'll look for 2 investor partners for the remaining 40%, but I retain majority control of the project. 51% minimum for me. The lawyer smiled. That's ambitious, but feasible, given the value of the land as collateral. Julio nodded. With that plan, we can start construction in 3 months. The complex would be finished in 18 months. By then, the transport station would already be in operation. Perfect timing. I gave them precise instructions. Prepare all the documentation. I want to start meetings with banks next week. And find serious investors, not speculators who want to resell quickly, people who understand long-term projects. The following days were a controlled whirlwind. Meetings with 3 different banks, each wanting to finance the project. Presentations to potential investors, men and women in expensive suits who reviewed the numbers with calculators and skeptical expressions that transformed into real interest when they saw the projections. Constant calls from developers offering to buy the land directly. The offers increased every day: $12 million, $15 million, $18 million. I rejected them all. I wasn't selling, I was building. There's a fundamental difference between those two actions. A difference Veronica never understood. Selling is taking quick money and getting out. Building is creating value that generates more value over time. I signed a bank loan a month after the official announcement, $14 million with a mortgage guarantee on the land. A preferential rate for being a project in a priority development zone. I found 2 investor partners, a private equity firm that contributed $4 million and a group of local entrepreneurs who put in another $3 million. I maintained 52% control. The legal structure was perfect. The company incorporated building permits in accelerated process thanks to the advantages for projects in new transport corridor zones. Everything was falling into place like perfectly aligned dominoes. I hired the most reputable construction firm I could afford. Not the most expensive, but the most reliable. I gave them Julio's project and a non-negotiable deadline, 18 months until final delivery. The foreman, a 60-year-old man with 40 years of experience, reviewed the plans and nodded. It's ambitious, but realistic. We can do it. We signed a contract on Friday. The following Monday, the machines arrived at the land. Backhoes, graders, dump trucks. The roar of diesel engines filled that space that for decades had only known silence and wind. I stood on the edge of the land, watching the machines begin to transform the earth, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: genuine pride, not arrogant pride, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who knows they did things correctly. During those first days of construction, I established another routine. I kept working in my regular job because I needed a stable income, but every afternoon I drove to the land to supervise progress, not as a bossy manager, but as an engineer checking that things were done right. I checked levels, inspected foundations, talked to workers about technical details. They respected me because I understood their work, because I'd been in their shoes, because my father had been one of them. I wasn't the distant investor who only shows up for photos. I was the engineer in work boots, checking every square meter of poured concrete. 2 months after construction began, the foundations were complete, the steel columns began to rise. The project was taking physical shape, moving from computer renders to a real structure you could touch, measure, walk. I hired a photographer to document the progress every week, not out of vanity, but because I knew someday I'd want to remember exactly how this was built. Each photo showed tangible progress. In my rented apartment, I taped some of those photographs to the wall next to my bed. They were the first thing I saw every morning when I woke up and the last thing before sleeping. My reminder that patience, knowledge, and correct timing are worth more than ambitious haste. 3 months had passed since the divorce. I was still living in the same small apartment, eating simple food, wearing worn clothes. People who knew me probably thought I was depressed, stuck in my new single divorce life. They didn't know that every dollar I didn't spend on appearances was being reinvested in the project. They didn't know that the quiet engineer they saw in the office was building something that would completely change his financial situation. And it was fine that they didn't know. Noise attracts unnecessary attention. Silence allows you to work without interference. For months after the divorce, one Saturday morning, I was at the land supervising the installation of the first metal structures on the upper level. The weather was perfect, clear sky, pleasant temperature. The workers moved with rehearsed precision, welding beams, tightening bolts, checking levels. I was reviewing blueprints with the foreman when one of the workers approached me. "Engineer, there's a car parked at the entrance. A couple looking this way. Looks like they want to come in." I told him to go ask them what they needed. He nodded and walked towards the temporary entrance we'd built, a chain-link fence with a gate and a sign that read, "Construction in progress. No trespassing." I continued working, focused on a structural detail that wasn't entirely convincing me. 5 minutes later, the worker returned. They say they just want to look from the entrance, that the gentleman knew this land from before. I nodded, not giving it importance. Curious people were common. The announcement of the transport corridor had turned this area into a tourist attraction for investors and onlookers. But something in my instinct made me turn. From where I stood, about 100 meters from the entrance, I could see the car, a black Mercedes, the same black Mercedes I'd seen 4 months ago parked in preferential spots. And next to it, two figures, a woman in a coral dress and large sunglasses, a man in a light shirt and dress pants, Veronica and Fernando. My first impulse was to stay where I was. Keep working, ignore them completely. But there was something deeply satisfying in the idea that they were there looking, trying to understand what was happening. It wasn't revenge, I felt. It was simply silent justice materializing. I told the foreman to continue without me, that I'd be back in 10 minutes. I walked slowly towards the entrance, my boots kicking up dust on the dirt road that would soon be paved concrete. As I approached, I could see their expressions more clearly. Veronica had her mouth slightly open, that expression of someone who can't believe what they're seeing. Fernando looked around, his usual confidence replaced by visible confusion. I reached 3 meters from the fence. They were on the other side, clinging to the mesh like children looking at a closed amusement park. Veronica saw me first. "Daniel," she said, and in that single word there was a mix of shock, confusion, and disbelief she couldn't hide. I took off my hard hat and held it under my arm. "Hello, Veronica." "Fernando, what brings you here?" My voice was calm, neutral, as if I were greeting casual acquaintances at the supermarket. Fernando found his voice first, that businessman's voice accustomed to controlling conversations. "We were passing through the area and saw all this construction. This is your land, right? The land you chose in the divorce." I told him yes, it was my land. He looked back at the structures rising, at the machines working, at the workers moving like organized ants. Veronica finally spoke. "What's going on here, Daniel? What is all this?" There was no accusation in her voice, only genuine confusion mixed with something that dangerously resembled panic. I explained with the same calmness I would use to describe any engineering project. "It's a mixed-use commercial development. 32 units on the ground floor, 40 offices on upper levels, underground parking, 18 months of construction, total investment of $21 million. Opening scheduled to coincide with the inauguration of the transport station, which will be 200 meters from here." I watched her process every word. I saw the exact moment she understood what she'd done. Her eyes moved from the project to me, back to the project, again to me. "But this land was worthless," she whispered. "It was useless." I smiled softly. "It wasn't useless, Veronica. It just seemed useless to someone who couldn't see beyond the obvious." Fernando intervened, his businessman's brain trying to understand the numbers. "Wait, you said $21 million investment. Where did you get that money? I thought you'd lost everything in the divorce." I explained without going into unnecessary details. The land significantly appreciated in value after the announcement of the transport corridor. That allowed me to secure bank financing and attract investor partners. The development is self-financed with the value of the land as collateral. Fernando frowned. "But the announcement was only 4 months ago. How'd you get all this done so quickly? Permits, designs, financing that takes years." I told him the truth. I started preparing this over a year ago, long before the divorce. I watched as those words impacted Veronica. Her face went through several emotions in a matter of seconds. Confusion, understanding, disbelief. Finally, something close to horror. "You knew," she said. "You knew this was going to happen. You knew about the transport corridor before we went to Enrique's office?" I held her gaze. I knew the government was considering this area for infrastructure development. I had contacts in the municipality. I did my research, but I didn't know with absolute certainty until the announcement was public. That's why I never lied. I just didn't share information that no one asked me for. Fernando laughed with bitter incredulity. "You tricked us. You acted as if that land was worthless, so she'd give it to you." I shook my head. "I didn't trick you. You assumed. You saw a dusty piece of land and decided it was useless without investigating, without asking, without even considering that it might have future value. I simply knew information that you didn't bother to seek. Veronica clung to the fence with both hands. Her usual elegance had evaporated. She looked small, vulnerable, lost. "How much is it worth now?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How much is that damn land worth now?" I gave her the numbers with the same neutrality I used in technical reports. With the development complete, conservative projections estimate a value of $40 million. Monthly rents from commercial units and offices will generate approximately $300,000 monthly after operating expenses. That's $3,600,000 a year in passive income. I saw her legs almost give way. Fernando had to hold her arm. She took off her sunglasses and looked directly at me. Her eyes were red. "I gave up $70 million for that land," she said. "I thought I was making the deal of my life. I thought you were an idiot for choosing this." I said nothing. There was no need to rub in her mistake. Silence was more eloquent than any words. Fernando tried to regain some composure. "Well, I guess congratulations, Daniel. Smart move." His voice sounded hollow, forced. Behind them, another car parked. It was Ramiro arriving for our scheduled meeting. He got out of his vehicle, saw me talking to Veronica and Fernando, and his expression changed to immediate understanding. He approached slowly, greeted with a neutral gesture. Veronica recognized him. "You," she said, "you work in urban planning. You told Daniel about the transport corridor." Ramiro didn't deny it. He confirmed. He just said, "The master plan was public information months before the official announcement. Anyone with contacts in the municipality could have known. You just had to ask." Veronica turned and walked towards the Mercedes. Fernando looked at me one last time, searching for something in my expression, perhaps expecting to see triumph or mockery. He only found tranquility. He left too. They drove off, and a black car disappeared down the road, leaving a cloud of dust. Ramiro whistled softly. "Brother, that was the moment you were waiting for, right?" I told him no, that wasn't the moment I was waiting for, because I had never waited for a moment of confrontation. I had only worked, planned, built. If they decided to pass by here and see it, that was their choice. Ramiro smiled. "You're colder than I thought, Daniel." We returned to the land, where work continued without pause. The machines kept their mechanical ballet, the workers kept building, the project kept advancing, and I remained the same, calm, focused, patient. That night, I couldn't sleep immediately, not from anxiety or excitement, but because my mind replayed Veronica's expression over and over. I didn't feel malicious satisfaction. I felt something more complex, a mix of relief and sadness for 25 years wasted with someone who never really saw me. I got out of bed at 2 a.m., made coffee, and sat by my apartment window. Outside, the city slept with its scattered lights. I thought of my father, of how he'd worked his whole life without seeking recognition, building homes for families who could barely pay him, saving every penny to buy that land everyone considered useless. He never saw the development of the transport corridor. He died simply believing that someday that land would be worth something, because the city always grows. He was right, but for reasons even he didn't imagine. On Sunday, I went to the land, although no work was scheduled. I needed to walk through that space in silence, without the noise of machines or workers' voices. The structure already stood imposing, 3 levels of concrete and steel casting long shadows in the morning sun. I walked among the columns, climbed the temporary stairs to the upper level, and from there observed the complete panorama. In the distance, the city could be seen, its buildings small from this distance, closer, the road that would soon be an avenue, and right there, marked with stakes and official signs, the place where the transport station would be built. Everything was connected, everything made sense, and I was exactly at the center of that convergence. My phone rang, an unknown number. I answered, and a female voice identified herself as Estella, a journalist from a local economic newspaper. "Mr. Daniel, we're doing a report on the new commercial developments in the Southern Corridor area. Your project has attracted a lot of attention. Would you like to give us an interview?" I told her no. I prefer to keep a low profile until the project was more advanced. She insisted. It's an excellent opportunity to promote the commercial spaces before the opening. Many businesses are looking for premises in this area. I politely declined again. I didn't need publicity yet. Good projects sell themselves when the time is right. She said goodbye with professional disappointment, and we hung up. 2 days later, Julio the architect called me excited. Daniel, we have 3 companies interested in renting entire blocks of offices before construction ends. An accounting firm, a digital marketing agency, and a technology company. They want 5-year contracts. The figures they're offering are above our initial projections. We met that afternoon in his office. He showed me the proposals. The numbers were solid. Monthly rents that guaranteed not only covering the loans, but generating profits from the first month of operation. I gave him the green light to start formal negotiations, but with one condition. Contracts that benefit both parties long-term, not just to exploit the moment of high demand. Julio nodded. That's thinking about sustainability, not just short-term gain. Exactly the kind of vision that makes projects successful. In my regular job, my boss called me into his office. Daniel, I've noticed you've been different lately, more focused, more confident, and I heard a rumor that you have a big personal project underway. I confirmed that yes, I was developing an independent commercial project. He smiled. I'm glad to hear it. I always knew you had more potential than this place can offer you. If someday you decide to dedicate yourself completely to your projects, I'll understand. But while you're here, you remain one of my best engineers. I thanked him for his words. I had no plans to resign yet. I needed the stability of that income until the development was generating real money, but it was comforting to know I had options. 6 months after the divorce, I received an unexpected call from Enrique, Veronica's lawyer. His tone was professional, but noticeably less arrogant than at our last meeting. Mr. Daniel, I'm calling you about a personal matter, not a legal one. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you during the divorce process. I assumed, like everyone else, that you were the weaker party in that separation. Now I see I was completely wrong. You played things with an intelligence that frankly surpasses that of most of my business clients. I told Enrique there was no need for apologies, that he was just doing his job representing his client. He sighed. I understand, but unofficially, Daniel, we both know it's pointless. All the information about the transport corridor was public. The fact that she didn't investigate doesn't constitute concealment. I just want to give you a courtesy heads up before this gets ugly. I thanked him for the courtesy and hung up. That afternoon, my lawyer confirmed what Enrique had hinted at. Veronica is looking for legal angles to claim part of the development, but it's pointless. The land was yours before the marriage. You legally claimed it in the divorce. And there was no fraud or concealment. You were simply more informed than her. That's not illegal. He prepared a preemptive legal response, a document that clarified every step of the process, every public document consulted, every decision timeline. If she decided to sue, we were prepared to destroy her argument at the first hearing, but I hoped it wouldn't come to that. Not out of pity for her, but because legal processes consume time and energy, I preferred to invest in the project. Construction advanced on schedule. 8 months after the start. The 3 levels were complete. Glass facades were beginning to be installed. The underground parking was functional. The project was taking its final shape, transforming from a bare structure into a real commercial building. Workers now totaled almost 100 people on site daily: electricians, plumbers, air conditioning system installers, carpenters for interior finishes. It was like managing a small temporary city. And I knew every supervisor by name, understood every phase of the work, personally checked every critical detail. One afternoon, while inspecting the installation of the electrical systems, one of the veteran workers approached me. Engineer, I've been in construction for 30 years, and I've seen many projects, but I've never seen an owner who understands the work like you. Most just show up for photos when everything is pretty. You come every day, check everything, talk to us as equals. That speaks well of your character. I thanked him for his words. I told him my father was a builder and taught me that buildings aren't made by blueprints or money. They're made by the hands of the people who build them. The man nodded with renewed respect and went back to work. Those moments were worth more than any amount of money. 10 months after construction began, I signed the first rental contracts. 3 companies for offices, 7 businesses for commercial premises, all with long-term contracts, all with fair but lucrative rents. The projected cash flow was already real on legal paper. My accountant reviewed the numbers and whistled. "Daniel, in 2 years, you'll be generating more money monthly than you earn in a year as an employed engineer. And that's without selling anything, just renting. This is real wealth creation." I told him that was always the plan. I wasn't looking for a quick windfall. I was looking to build something that would generate sustainable value for decades. A year after the divorce, the project was in its final finishing stages. Porcelain floors were being installed in the commercial spaces. The offices received their interior divisions and LED lighting systems. The underground parking was fully functional with its ventilation and signage system. Outside, the perimeter gardens were beginning to take shape with young trees and shrubs that in a few years would provide shade and beauty. The complex was no longer just structure and concrete. It was a real place where hundreds of people would soon work daily. I hired a specialized company for the signage. A sober, elegant design, unpretentious. The name I chose for the development was simple, Horizonte Commercial Center, no surname, no personal references. Just a name that spoke of future and possibilities. The transport station was also advancing rapidly 200 meters away. I could see the structures rising, the platforms taking shape, the rails being installed on concrete bases. The government had met its schedule with unusual precision. The inauguration was scheduled for 4 months from now, exactly when my development would be ready to open. The timing couldn't be better. Ramiro visited me one Saturday, and we walked through the almost finished complex together. "Brother, this is impressive," he said, looking around. "You turned a piece of desert into this, and you did it in less than 2 years since the divorce." "I didn't do it alone," I told him. "You gave me the information. Julio designed this. The workers built it. I just coordinated the pieces." He shook his head. "Don't diminish your merit. Many would have sold the land for quick money. You saw further." I received another call from Veronica, this time directly, not through lawyers. Her voice sounded different, tired, defeated. "Daniel, I need to talk to you. In person if possible." I asked her about what. There was a long silence. "About many things. Please." I agreed to meet in a neutral cafe, not near the land or near any place with shared meaning. I arrived first. She appeared 10 minutes later wearing jeans and a simple lavender blouse, without the elegant dress or heels. Without Fernando, she looked smaller, more human, more vulnerable than ever. She sat across from me and, for a minute, just stared at her coffee without tasting it. Finally, she spoke. "Fernando left me 2 months ago. Turns out Antonio was right. He was deeply in debt. He used my divorce money to pay his creditors. When it ran out, he left with another woman who has family money. I was left with less than half of what I was entitled to." I listened without interrupting. I found no satisfaction in her pain, only a distant sadness for lost time and wrong decisions. She continued, "I've been thinking a lot these past few months about how I treated you, about how I always saw you as someone without ambition, without vision, without a future. And it turns out you had all that, just in a way I couldn't see because I was too focused on appearances." I told her I hadn't come to hear apologies, that the past was already closed. Veronica looked up. "I didn't come to apologize, Daniel. Or maybe I did, I don't know. I came because I needed to tell you I was wrong about you, about what matters in life, about everything. I spent 50 years of my life chasing the version of success other people told me I should chase, and in the end, I have nothing, no money, no partner, not even my pride. You, on the other hand, built something real." I drank my coffee before responding. "Success isn't what I built, Veronica. Success is knowing who you are and not needing others to validate it. I didn't build that development to prove anything to you. I built it because it was the right decision with the information I had. If you had been by my side as a true partner, I would have shared that information with you. But you made it clear years ago that we were competitors, not a team." She nodded slowly. I know. And that was my loss, not yours. We fell silent. There was nothing more to say, really. She finished her coffee and stood up. Thanks for meeting me, she said. I hope your project is successful. I really do. She left, and I stayed alone in that cafe, watching through the window as she walked towards her car. A modest sedan very different from the black Mercedes of a year ago. I paid the bill and drove to the development. Work continued even on Saturday. Some contractors rushing last details to meet delivery dates. 2 months before the inauguration, I organized a private event for the future tenants. A guided tour of the almost finished complex. The owners of the businesses who had signed contracts came, their managers, their interior architects. I showed them each space, explained the energy efficiency features, the security systems, the access facilities. One of them, owner of a restaurant chain that would rent 3 premises, asked me how long I'd been in the real estate development business. I told him the truth. This was my first project. He laughed, thinking I was joking. When he saw I was serious, his expression changed to respect. For your first development, this is executed at the level of an experienced professional. I thanked him and explained that I'd spent 25 years as a civil engineer learning how things are built correctly. I simply applied that knowledge on a larger scale. The inauguration was scheduled for a Friday in March. I decided not to have a big event. Just a simple ribbon-cutting ceremony with local authorities present, some media. The mayor came and gave a speech about economic development and opportunities. Ramiro was there representing the development secretariat. Julio, the architect, my lawyer, the investor partners, the retired construction foreman, and some of the workers who had been there since day one. I didn't invite Veronica, not out of cruelty, but because she wasn't part of this story. This story began when she left my life. Not before. I cut the green ribbon with the mayor. The doors opened. The first tenants began to move in that same afternoon. Moving trucks, workers installing furniture, business owners supervising their new spaces. The parking lot filled quickly. The complex came to life almost instantly. I walked every hallway, every level, observing how something that only existed in blueprints and renders became a functional reality full of human activity. On the ground floor, a cafe opened that same day. I went in and ordered coffee. The barista, a young woman with genuine enthusiasm, asked me if I worked in one of the offices. I told her something like that. She smiled. This place is incredible. You're going to do really good business here. I paid for my coffee and left without revealing who I was. The transport station opened 2 weeks later. Thousands of people began passing daily in front of the Horizonte Commercial Center. The flow of customers for the businesses exceeded projections. The offices were all rented before the second month. The waiting list for available spaces grew weekly. My accountant showed me the numbers for the first quarter of operation. Daniel, you're generating $40,000 monthly after all expenses. In a year, you'll have recovered your initial investment. After that, everything's profit. The bank loans pay themselves with the rents. This is an asset that will generate wealth for decades. I resigned from my job at the engineering firm, not with bitterness or triumphalism, only with gratitude for the years of experience and learning. My boss shook my hand and wished me success. I always knew you'd do something great, Daniel. I just thought it would be within this company. I told him some paths you have to walk alone. He understood. On my last day, I cleaned out my desk, put away my drafting tools, and left that office where I'd spent 20 years of my professional life. I didn't look back. The future was elsewhere. 18 months after the divorce, I moved out of that rented apartment, not to a mansion or an ostentatious residence. I bought a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, 3 bedrooms, a small garden, a 2-car garage. It was similar to the house Veronica and I had at the beginning of our marriage, the one she considered evidence of my lack of ambition. The difference was that this time I bought it cash, no mortgage, no debts, and I bought it because I liked it, not to impress anyone. I hired a decorator, but gave him clear instructions: functional, comfortable, unpretentious. The result was a space that felt like home. not a showroom. The Horizonte Commercial Center operated at full capacity. Monthly reports showed consistently positive numbers. Companies requested space expansion. New businesses asked to join the waiting list. The area around the development exploded with economic activity. Other investors bought nearby land and started their own projects. Restaurants, gas stations, small shops sprang up as a natural consequence of the flow of people. I've been the one who saw the opportunity when it was just information in government documents. Now, I was simply part of a thriving commercial ecosystem, and that was fine. I didn't need to be the only successful one to feel validated. Ramiro and I met monthly for lunch. At one of those meals, he confessed something to me. You know why I showed you that map 2 years ago? It wasn't just friendship. It was because I saw how Veronica treated you at social gatherings, the way she belittled you in front of others, and I thought you deserve a chance to change your situation. I never imagined you'd execute it so perfectly. I thanked him. I told him that map didn't change my situation. It just gave me the tool to change it myself. There's a difference. Many people get opportunities and do nothing with them because they're not prepared or don't have the character to execute. Ramiro nodded. You're right. That's why I respect what you did so much. Julio contacted me with an interesting proposal. Daniel, I have clients looking to develop similar projects in other parts of the city. They're impressed with Horizonte and want to work with you as an associate developer. You don't need to put in money, just your experience and your reputation. Share profits. I consider the offer carefully. I could become a professional developer, multiply my wealth exponentially, build a real estate empire. But something inside me resisted that direction. I didn't want to become like those investors who chase project after project with no emotional connection to any. I told Julio I'd think about it. But my priority was to ensure Horizonte functioned perfectly before considering anything new. He understood. That's long-term thinking, not short-term greed. One afternoon, I was at Horizonte supervising quarterly maintenance when I saw someone familiar entering the ground floor cafe. It was Antonia, Veronica's sister. She saw me and approached with a friendly but cautious expression. Daniel, what a surprise to find you here. I've been working in one of the second-level offices for 2 months. I didn't know this was your project. I confirmed that yes, it was mine. She looked around with genuine admiration. This is impressive. Veronica told me about this, but I'd never come to see it personally. Now I understand why she's so affected. She didn't just lose money. She lost the opportunity to be part of something truly valuable. I asked her how Veronica was. Antonia sighed. Surviving. She got a job at a smaller consulting firm. Lives in a simple apartment. She's in therapy trying to process everything that happened. I think she's finally understanding that she chased the wrong things her whole life. I told her I hoped she found peace and clarity. Antonia briefly touched my arm. You're a better person than she is, Daniel. You always were. That's why this worked for you. Not just because you had information or did the calculations correctly, but because you have integrity. That's something you can't buy or fake. We said goodbye cordially. She returned to her office, and I continued with the maintenance supervision. 2 years after the divorce, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was Enrique, the lawyer. His tone was completely different from our previous encounters. Mr. Daniel, I'm calling you on a personal matter, not a legal one. I wanted to apologize for how I treated you during the divorce process. I assumed, like everyone, that you were the weaker party in that separation. Now I see I was completely wrong. You played things with an intelligence that frankly surpasses that of most of my business clients. I told him there was no need for apologies, that he was just doing his job representing his client. He insisted, there's a difference between doing your job and being condescending. I was the latter, and I wanted to acknowledge it. I thanked him for his call, and we hung up. I didn't need his validation, but it was interesting to see how perception changes when reality reveals itself. On the 3rd anniversary of Horizonte's construction start, I organized a small celebration with the team that made the project possible. Ramiro, Julio, my lawyer, the retired construction foreman, some of the original workers, the investor partners. We rented a room in one of the complex's restaurants. There were no grand speeches or exaggerated toasts. Just people who worked together, sharing a meal and remembering the process. The foreman raised his glass to Daniel, who taught us that patience and knowledge are worth more than haste and blind ambition. Everyone toasted. I thanked them, but deflected the credit. This was everyone's work. I just had the luck to be in the right place with the right information at the right time. After dinner, I walked alone through the complex. It was Friday night, and the place was full of activity. Families dining in the restaurants, young people in the cafes, lights on in some offices where people worked late. This place had taken on a life of its own. It was no longer my project. It was part of the community, and that was exactly how it should be. Good projects transcend their creators. I went up to the third level and out onto the maintenance terrace that few knew about. From there, you could see the entire area, the transport station glowing with its LED lights, the new developments around, the city stretching into the distance, and in the middle of it all, this complex that began as 8 hectares of dusty land no one wanted. I took out my phone and opened the photo folder I'd kept since the beginning. The first image was of the empty land, just stones and weeds under the open sky. I scrolled through the construction photos, foundations, steel columns, levels taking shape, facades being installed, until I reached the recent photos of the complex operating at full capacity. The transformation was complete. But more than the transformation of the land, I had undergone my own transformation. From an employed engineer underestimated by his wife to an independent developer who built something significant. Not out of revenge, not to prove anything, simply because I saw an opportunity and had the knowledge, patience, and character to execute it. My phone rang. It was my mother. She called me every week to see how I was. Mom, I'm fine. I'm at the complex. She asked if I was working so late again. I told her no, I was just reflecting. There was a silence. My son, your father would be so proud of you, not for the money or the project, but because you did something with integrity, with patience, respecting hard work. That's what he valued. I felt a lump in my throat. I told her all this started with the land he left me, with his vision that someday it would be worth something. She laughed softly. Your father always said land never loses value. It just waits for the right person to reveal its potential. It seems you were that right person. We hung up, and I stayed on that terrace a little longer, feeling the night breeze. I thought of Veronica rebuilding her life in a small apartment. I thought of Fernando, probably cheating another woman with hidden debts. I thought of all the people who underestimated me, who saw me as a failure or lacking ambition, and I realized something fundamental. I never needed to prove anything to them. Real success doesn't seek an audience, doesn't need witnesses, doesn't require external validation. Real success is the peace of knowing you made the right decisions for the right reasons and built something that transcends your ego. I came down from the terrace and walked to my car. In the parking lot, a family was leaving the cinema that operated in one of the commercial units. The children laughed, the parents looked happy. I crossed paths with them, and the father nodded to me with that universal gesture of recognition between strangers. I got in my truck, the same truck with rusty bumpers I drove when Veronica left me. I could buy a new, luxurious, imported car, but this truck worked perfectly. It had accompanied me on every visit to the land, in every stage of construction. It had sentimental value, and unlike what Veronica believed, sentimental value isn't weakness. It's a reminder of where you come from and who you really are. I drove home with the windows open, feeling the cool night air. An old song my father used to listen to was playing on the radio. The streets were quiet. I arrived home, parked, and before going in, I stood for a moment looking at the stars. 3 years had passed since that day in Enrique's office, since that signature Veronica considered her victory. 3 years since she said, "Keep that. It's useless anyway." It turned out it wasn't useless. It never was. It just needed patience, knowledge, and the vision to see beyond the obvious. I went into my house, got ready, sat on my comfortable sofa, and opened a book. Outside, the city slept, and I was finally exactly where I deserved to be.